The Master of the Mint, April 20th, 1720. The Royal Mint, Tower of London. The air in the Master's office was thick with the scent of melted Spanish silver, old stone, and ink. Sir Isaac Newton, 77 years old, President of the Royal Society, and for over 2 decades the Master of the Mint, dipped his quill. The scratch of the nib on parchment was a counterpoint to the distant, rhythmic clanging of coin presses below. His was not the abstract world of celestial mechanics here. It was the gritty realm of specie weight, assay reports, and the constant, bloody war against counterfeiters. He signed a warrant for the execution of 3 clippers, men who shaved slivers of precious metal from coin edges with the same dispassionate precision he used to calculate the orbit of the moon. A trusted clerk entered, placing a fresh bundle of ledgers on the oak desk. But atop them was a sheaf of different papers, their margins filled not with treasury seals but with the frantic inky mathematics of speculation. Stock certificates, subscription receipts, promissory notes, all bore the same, now legendary name, the South Sea Company. Newton pushed his spectacles up the bridge of his nose, his gaze moving from the warrants of death to the warrants of fortune. For months, the chatter had been inescapable. In coffee houses from Garraway's to Jonathan's, the language was no longer of trade or philosophy, but of subscriptions, annuities, and projections. The South Sea Company granted a monopoly on trade with Spanish South America in exchange for assuming a massive portion of the national debt was the flame. Every investor in Britain was a moth, and Newton had already been singed. The previous year, shrewdly, cautiously, he had purchased £7,000 worth of South Sea stock. As the price began its dizzying climb, from £128 a share in January to over £300 by spring, he watched his investment triple. The intellectual satisfaction was profound. He had observed the phenomenon, calculated the trend, and acted. And then, with the prudence that had defined his life's work, he had sold. He had locked in a profit of over £14,000, a colossal sum, nearly a decade of his salary as Master of the Mint. He stood walking to the narrow window. Below, the Thames flowed, a murky ribbon of commerce. He could almost hear the echo of the stock jobbers' cries from Exchange Alley, a mile away. He had mastered the laws of the universe. He had reformed the nation's currency. He had outsmarted the market once. The ledgers on his desk proved it. The numbers did not lie. Yet a gnawing sensation persisted. It was not in his stomach, but in his mind, a profound, unsettling itch. The numbers were lying. The price continued to soar, defying any rational valuation, any sober assessment of the company's actual profits from the slave trading concessions it barely utilized. It was a bubble of pure, intoxicating expectation. He knew this. He, of all men, understood the principle: what goes up, unchecked by genuine force, must come down. But as he watched friends, peers, and nobles he despised amass paper fortunes, as he read the frantic calculations in the margins of his own reports, a different kind of gravity took hold. It was the gravity of the crowd, of watching a universe he believed he understood suddenly operate on new, illogical rules. It was the unbearable thought that his genius, his peerless logic, had caused him to exit the stage too early. It solved for X, but the market was now writing an entirely new equation. He sat back down, the execution warrants forgotten. His fingers traced the embossed seal on a South Sea subscription document. The greatest scientific mind of the age, the man who had parsed the very laws of motion, was now engaged in a brutal calculus of envy and doubt. June 1720. Lincoln's Inn Fields, London. The air in Sir Isaac's townhouse was still, heavy with the scent of beeswax and old books. But the quiet was an illusion, a fragile shell around a gathering storm. Newspapers from the London Gazette to scandal sheets lay scattered across his study, all screaming the same triumphant, relentless headline: South Sea rises again. The share price, that monstrous number, had not obeyed his private calculations. It had laughed at them. After his prudent sale at £300, it had sliced through £400, then £500, and by June it was approaching £700. The city was drunk on it. Footmen were buying carriages. Maids were ordering silk. The noise of celebration was a constant hum against his windows, a taunt to his reason. His own £14,000 profit, once a testament to his shrewdness, now felt like a child's prize. Peers who had held their nerve were boasting of fortunes 10 times larger. The Earl of Bridgewater had made £40,000. The Postmaster General, £50,000. The whispers reached him at Royal Society meetings in the corridors of the Mint. Even the great Newton misjudged it. Too cautious, too theoretical. The insult was not to his pride, but to his entire worldview. The universe was orderly. It obeyed laws. This market, this frenzied human creation, seemed to be proving his life's work, the very concept of predictable systems, wrong. He spent nights not with his alchemical experiments or lunar tables, but with fresh ledgers recalculating. He constructed new models, factoring in the influx of capital from the continent, the government's backing, the public mania. Perhaps there was a new logic here, a economic physics he had not yet codified. The sheer momentum, he reasoned, could be a force in itself. It could create its own reality, bending the traditional rules of value. The crowd's belief, if sustained, could become the underlying asset. It was in this state of tortured ray analysis that the invitation arrived. Private dinner with the company's directors, including the charismatic, ruthless John Blunt. It was held in an opulent hall near the Exchange, a temple to the new gods of credit. Newton, in his somber wig and plain coat, was an anachronism among the glittering silks and diamond shoe buckles. Blunt, a master of the craft, did not hard sell. He presented numbers, beautiful, smooth projections of trade with the silver mountains of Potosi, of endless demand for English wool in tropical climates. He spoke not of stock, but of destiny. "We are not merely traders, Sir Isaac," Blunt said, his voice silken. "We are architects of Britain's future. The share price is not a speculation, it is a barometer of national glory." He then leaned in confidential. "And we have plans, a new subscription, a bond conversion. The ceiling," he said, smiling, "is of our own making." That night Newton walked home through the raucous streets, Blunt's words echoing. The man was a sophist, Newton knew this. But the numbers, the public fervor, the government stake, it formed a system. A chaotic one, perhaps, but a system nonetheless. And if anyone could find the pattern in the chaos, it was he. To walk away now would be an admission that the human heart in its greed was less decipherable than the motion of comets. The decision, when he made it, was not one of greed, but of intellectual conquest. He would not be bested by a mob. He would re-enter not as a gambler, but as a master physicist applying a corrected formula. In late June, as the share price kissed £700, Sir Isaac Newton committed a colossal portion of his wealth. He bought back in, purchasing a massive new parcel of South Sea stock. He did not buy at the peak. He bought as the peak was still being forged, convinced by his new calculus that the true summit was yet ahead. He had mathematized the madness, and the equation told him to buy. Early September 1720. The Royal Exchange, London. A taut, brittle energy had replaced the carnival. The shouts of the stock jobbers in the alley no longer sang of limitless ascent. They were sharp, barking things laced with a new, metallic fear. The price had stalled. It had trembled at £775, a dizzying height that seemed to touch the very ceiling of the world, and then it had simply stopped climbing. For Isaac Newton, watching from the remove of the mint, this was not yet panic. It was a consolidation, a natural pause. His revised calculations allowed for this. Every action had an equal and opposite reaction. The market was merely catching its breath. But then the first cracks appeared, fine as hairline fractures in glass. Whispers became conversations. The company's directors, men like Blunt, had begun quietly selling their own holdings. The architects of the future were secretly dismantling the scaffolding. A major investor, a prominent goldsmith, failed to meet a margin call, triggering a small, localized sell-off. The price dipped to £720. A shiver ran through the exchange. Newton received the news with a furrowed brow. He pored over the list of transactions, the flow of funds. This was not systemic, he concluded. It was profit-taking by the weak-handed, a necessary correction. The core of the company, the government charter, the debt scheme, the public faith, remained sound. He held. His genius was his compass, and it pointed unwaveringly to recovery. The atmosphere in the city curdled day by day. The newspapers turned nervous, then accusatory. Pamphlets appeared, detailing the fantastical, impossible nature of the South Sea Company's promised trade. Satirical prints showed Britannia riding a ballooning, grotesque whale labeled South Sea, about to burst. The chatter in coffee houses shifted from "What will you buy?" to "Have you heard?" The most damning rumor was the simplest. There was no more money left to buy. Every fool in the kingdom was already in. On September 2nd, the whale breached. The price broke through a critical threshold and fell to £650, not a dip, but a plunge. The trading floor at Jonathan's coffee house descended into a screaming, shoving chaos. Paper promises were now weapons of financial ruin, clutched in sweating hands as men tried to offload them onto anyone else. The noise was a physical assault, a roar of terror and rage. Newton stood in his study, a dispatch from his broker trembling slightly in his hand. The numbers on the page were wrong. They had to be. They represented a violation. He walked to his chalkboard, covered in the elegant, timeless symbols of calculus and orbital mechanics. With a savage sweep of his hand, he cleared a section and began to write a new, desperate set of figures: purchase price, current price, percentage loss. The chalk snapped in his fingers. He gave no order to sell. To sell now was to crystallize the error, to admit that the universe had in this one domain become truly lawless. It was to confess that the greatest mind of the Enlightenment could be as foolish as any footman caught up in a craze. This was not the market's collapse, it was a test of nerve. A great correction required a great resilience. He instructed his broker to watch for the support, the moment when the natural laws of economics would reassert themselves and the fallen body would find its new stable level. That moment never came. The support lines he drew in his mind were vaporized as the price fell through them. £550, £450. It was a dead weight in freefall, and with a dawning, icy horror, Isaac Newton understood the force at play. It was not a new kind of physics. It was the oldest force in the world, fear. And fear, once it reached critical mass, generated a gravity all its own, a gravity that distorted all reason, that bent light into lies, and from which not even light itself, not even genius, could escape. November 1st, 1720. The quiet of his study at Woolsthorpe Manor, Lincolnshire. The silence here was absolute, a stark cloth drawn over the cacophony of London. Sir Isaac had fled the city. The Mint, the Royal Society, the coffee houses, everywhere he went, he saw the same hollow-eyed stare, the same ruined set of the shoulders. He heard the whispers no longer of fortune, but of debtors' prisons and whispered suicides. He could not bear to be a monument among the ruins. So he returned to the manor of his birth, to the famous apple orchard, now bare and skeletal against a gray autumn sky. Before him on the desk lay 2 documents. One was the final accounting from his broker. The numbers were stark, devoid of elegance or mercy. His total loss exceeded £20,000, a fortune so vast it was nearly incomprehensible, more than £100,000 in today's value. It represented the majority of his life savings. The careful wealth accumulated from a lifetime of salary, inheritance, and prudent investment, obliterated in a few short months. He had not just lost his earlier profit, he had been driven deep into the principal, a devastating negative return on his fatal re-entry. The other document was a draft of a letter, its ink blotted from pauses and revisions. It was a response to an inquiry from the young Charles Montagu, the Earl of Halifax, a friend and the very man who had appointed him Master of the Mint. Montagu, too, had been scorched by the crash. The letter sought commiseration, perhaps a shared lament on the madness of men. Newton dipped his quill, but the words that flowed were not of shared grief. They were hard, precise, and famously damning. "I can calculate the motions of the heavenly bodies," he wrote, "but not the madness of people." It was a line that would echo through history, a perfect epitaph for the bubble. But as he set the quill down, the statement felt incomplete, a capitulation. He looked out at the gnarled apple tree, the prop of his legend. He had once deduced a universal force from a falling piece of fruit. Now he had been crushed by a falling market. The true horror, the unspeakable truth he could not commit to paper for Montagu, was that this was not a failure to calculate. It was a failure of the calculator. He had calculated the madness. He had charted its growth, measured its velocity, modeled its momentum. His fatal error was believing that, having quantified it, he could then outrun it. He had mistaken understanding for control. He had stood before the tidal wave of human emotion, armed with a sextant, taken a precise measurement of its height and speed, and concluded he could therefore command the sea. The crash was not an external, random event like a comet. It was the inevitable result of the system he had studied and re-entered. He had seen the bubble for what it was, and in that moment of supreme clarity, he had arrogantly believed he could time his dance within it. The genius had been seduced not by greed, but by the ultimate intellectual vanity, the belief that no system, however irrational, could defy his reason. He would never speak of it again. He returned to London to his duties. He lived another 7 years, a titan of science, showered with honors, overseeing the Mint with relentless efficiency. But the ledgers of the South Sea affair were closed, a brutal, private demonstration of a principle he had never included in his Principia, that in the markets, the gravitational pull of the crowd could, temporarily, bend even the straightest mind. He had charted the cosmos, but the darkest, most volatile universe he ever encountered was the one reflecting back from the speculative frenzy in a million human eyes. And in that universe, Sir Isaac Newton, the man who defined gravity, had been pulled in and shattered.